Hello, and welcome to None of the Above. My name is Steve Nemerovski, and I'm your host. On None of the Above, we try to examine why the political system has become so dysfunctional and polarized, and on every show we try and talk about solutions. No sense talking about the problem, in my opinion, if you're not going to also talk about solutions. I never know where my interviews or topics are going to come from, and I try and do a lot of reading. And I recently fell upon an article by Professor Drutman from St. John's, excuse me, not St. John's, Johns Hopkins University. I don't know why I've been confused by that. It's actually our second take. Johns Hopkins University. And he's trying to examine as to, he calls it, whether or not our political institutions can survive the current dysfunction in the system. In other words, what kind of pressure is all this dysfunction putting on the institutions, and how are we going to step up and deal with that? So it's a great article. And then, as you're going to see in the interview, it becomes a bit of a history lesson. Professor Drutman teaches at Johns Hopkins, and you can see he's very steeped in history, and he takes us all the way back to the 1930s to really develop some of his theories about where this dysfunction came from. So I found it a fascinating interview, not only for his perspectives on the system and systematic changes and things he wanted to do, but certainly the historical perspective that he brings to why the system is so dysfunctional and polarized. Our next guest is Lee Drutman, and I asked Lee how he introduces himself, and he said he's a writer, he's a scholar, he's a professor, and he's really all over the political scene, and really has quite a background. In some ways, his resume looks a lot like mine, only I'm guessing he's about 40 years younger and better looking, so there's a big difference there. But I read an article that Lee wrote, and I just saw it published the other day. It's called, Can Our Political Institutions Handle Our Political Divisions? So he's going right to the heart of our show. He's saying we have a dysfunctional political system, we have a polarized political system, and he's going to talk about how we're going to fix this system. He's piggybacking on some research that some others have done. I think there's some new ideas here. And on our show, we always want to have solutions. So we're going to talk to Lee about this dysfunction, and we're mostly going to drill down with him and press for some solutions, see how we can fix this system. So Lee, welcome to the show.
Good to be with you.
So I gave a bit of a background, and I said you're a professor, a scholar, blah, blah, blah. Let's fill in some blanks here. Professor at?
Johns Hopkins University.
Okay. Scholar at?
New America, which is a Washington, D.C. think tank. We are and civic enterprise committed to renewing American politics, prosperity, and purpose in the digital age.
So I'm disappointed you don't have that memorized. You had to read it.
That's true. It's true. I need to memorize it. But,
and most importantly, author of?
The Business of America is Lobbying, which is a book on the history of corporate lobbying in Washington, D.C.
Well,
Came out 2 years ago from Oxford University Press. They tell me there'll be a paperback edition out soon if you want to get a slightly lower price.
Okay, so The Business of America is Lobbying. Before we get to the interview, let's sell some books. Why does somebody want to read your book?
Because it gives a comprehensive history of how corporations came to overwhelm Washington, D.C. It's a compelling story with lots of data, and it'll give you also a pretty good understanding of how lobbying works and why it's such a difficult problem to solve.
It sounds like an oxymoron, a compelling story with lots of data.
Well, I don't know. I'm a political scientist, so.
Well, what you did is you took lots of data and made it compelling, right?
Yes.
Awesome. So Lee, when I saw your article and I was reading your background, and I obviously mentions New America, and you just read the blurb for what New America is about, but it seemed like a very exciting organization. So again, before we get to the interview, tell us a little bit about New America and, again, why my guests may want to take a look at it and go there to get educated.
Yeah, well, in particular, I mean, it's a wonderful think tank with a lot of interesting scholars here. I'm part of our political reform program, which is really trying to bring some new ideas to a stale conversation sometimes about political reform. And, one of the things that we're particularly excited about is sort of really thinking about electoral systems and the ways in which sort of structural forces of our political system are contributing to the gridlock and kind of dysfunction of our system, and trying to think really big, right? Not just small bore, little tweak here, but really big picture stuff.
I like that. Go big or go home. So why did you get excited about this topic? What is in your background or your life that led you to this?
Well, so I wrote a book about lobbying. I had sort of been concerned about corporate influence in Washington for a long time, and at the end of that book, I kind of was trying to say, well, why is lobbying so influential in Washington? And one reason that I came to understand is because we don't really invest in knowledge within Congress, which is where a lot of lobbying takes place. So basically, Congress has de-invested in its own institutional capacity for 4 decades now, and basically what happens is they outsource policy making to experts who happen to mostly be lobbyists. And since most lobbyists happen to represent large corporations and industries, corporations wield overwhelming power in policymaking process in Washington. Now, well, why is it that Congress doesn't invest in its own institutional knowledge capacity? Now, that's a kind of puzzling question because on the one hand, Congress...
you stole my job. You asked yourself your own question. I like that. Go ahead.
Well, it's an important question because on the one hand, Congress is an institution that, unlike pretty much any other institution in society, it can decide how much money to spend on itself. So if Congress wanted to, it could double its budget, it could triple its budget, because it has the power of the purse. And in the past, Congress has done that. So got me thinking a little bit, well, why is this? Why doesn't Congress spend more money on itself? And one of the things that's happened alongside the decline of congressional capacity is the rise of partisanship. So over this period, over the last 40 years, the organization and structure of Congress has changed. Used to be very much of a committee-based system with weak party leadership. Now it's very much of a strong party leadership, weak committee system. And so this is part and parcel of the polarization of Congress. So essentially the polarization of Congress goes alongside the weakening of Congress as an institution, because when you have a top-down system, committees are less relevant, therefore there's less reason to spend money on committees. And also individual members themselves have sort of less opportunity to actively participate in the process of developing expertise and legislation. So they don't really have strong as much of a desire to invest in their own policy capacity. More of it changes the types of people who want to run for Congress. Congress becomes more ideologues and less policy wonks, and there's sort of this reinforcing cycle that has happened where Congress is no longer a place where people work together across party lines, invest in real expertise, try to solve real problems. I mean, you see this happening with the healthcare bill, which is something that as we're we see that the Republicans were trying to push something through that was just basically a partisan bill. If they had wanted to really solve the problem, they could have worked a solution through committees, over a period of time. But healthcare has just become a partisan issue, like every other issue. So then you get to this question: well, why is there so much partisanship in Congress, and why is our politics so polarized? And then you start asking, well, it probably has something to do with the structure of our politics, and then you start to ask some really big questions.
So, Lee, I noticed that a lot of people, myself included, try to talk about when this spiral, use the word spiral, started. Many people point to the mid-'90s, but you're going back 40 years. What in your mind started happening 40 years ago that caused this?
Well, so let's go back even further. Let's go back to 1932, which is kind of where I think our modern story really ought to start. Which is basically that in 1932 we had a political realignment, and that we had basically a new party system, more or less. I mean, it was an update of the old party system, but we had a politics that was really organized around a set of economic questions about the size and scope of government, and that became sort of the central debate of our political system, and that created two parties that were basically were able to go against each other almost everywhere, because in the past you'd had parties that were more identity and regional based, and this sort of nationalized politics in an interesting way and created an interesting set of kind of cross-cutting cleavages as people started to think of themselves more as workers or managers, and not just in terms of their ethnic or religious or regional identities. And that was a politics that that was much less polarized, because you had these cross-cutting identities. And you had the two parties that were basically loose, overlapping coalitions. Now, there was people there, and Democrats made a compromise between their sort of Southern populist conservatives and Northern liberals to basically not bring up the issue of civil rights for a period of time, which was perhaps not a great compromise, but it did allow them to pass the New Deal. But it was it came at a great cost, and over into the 40s, 50s, into the 60s, Northern liberals in the party said that this is unacceptable, and we need to pass civil rights, which they were absolutely right. But they did that at a cost of breaking up the Democratic coalition, as Lyndon Johnson famously said. Well, there goes the South. Now, what happened was that the Republicans basically, as long as national politics was basically, if you can think of it as they're basically. It's basically in modern American politics, there's more or less kind of three distinct, well, I don't know if distinct, but rough categories of voters. Liberals, who are liberal on social issues and economic issues. Populists, who are liberal on economic issues and conservative on social issues, and conservatives who are conservative on both dimensions. And Democrats, when politics was organized around economic issues from about 1930 to 1970, Democrats had a winning coalition on economics, and that was around economics, with race and social issues as the submerged dimension. Now, once Democrats passed civil rights legislation, Republicans, who had lost, because the American public is more economically liberal than they are economically conservative, but they're also more socially conservative than they are socially liberal. So once civil rights passed and Republicans went aggressively after disaffected whites, they shifted the axis of political conflict to be more about identity and race and social issues. And that's sort of been the trajectory that we've been on since about 1980. Maybe since 1970, although there was sort of an interesting reversal in the 70s. But once the Reagan coalition came together, that's the trajectory that we've been on. And that's a much more polarizing trajectory, because without it doesn't give you any cross-cutting dimensions. If you're people tend to live with other people who are like them, and once you start thinking in terms of social identity, in terms of whether it's religious or ethnic, or now increasingly ethnic, these are sort of reinforcing dynamics that fuel polarization. Now, in many ways, this is a function of our two-party system. Because essentially, in order to have if we have winner-take-all elections, what happens is that you can really only have two coalitions in our sort of modern politics. If you have basically three groups, the liberals and the conservatives can't make a party coalition together, because they disagree on too much. So either the liberals make a coalition with the populists, or the conservatives make a coalition with the populists. And so either you have a politics that's organized around economic justice at the cost of social justice, or a politics like the one we have now, in which there is neither social justice nor economic justice. and that's a the politics that we have now, the way that our politics is structured, is particularly polarizing. Now, there are other, in addition to the winner-take-all elections that we have, the increasing strength of the presidency is another turbocharge for polarization, because you create these very high stakes national elections that go on for a long time, increasingly nasty negative campaigning that fuels the spiral of negative partisanship. Also, the role of money.
So Lee, let me cut you off there for a minute, because you transitioned from Congress, which is where we started, and then you leaped over the executives, and I want to slow you down a little bit on Congress first, and then get the executive. That's okay. So
that's okay.
So as you said, we had this transition that occurred in the 70s, right? But that still doesn't explain it starts to explain the dysfunction, but I'm not sure it starts to explain the polarization. Do you see them both starting at the same time, or not necessarily?
Well, I mean, they reinforce each other, right? As politics becomes more polarized, it starts to become more dysfunctional, because we have institutions that are essentially set up to require a certain amount of compromise and a certain amount of give and take. You can think of it. I mean, basically, if you want to get a little theoretical, and I always do, is that democracy exists on a kind of fundamental tension. That every theory of democracy says, well, you need to have parties in order for there to be a democracy, because you need to have some amount of contestation and competition to keep both sides honest and give voters a choice. Now, but most theorists will also say something to the effect of, well, democracy requires there to be competing parties, but those parties must adhere to certain norms of fair play, and that the ins and the outs will accept that whatever disagreements they have a shared faith that there are certain rules and certain norms that we all respect and we all acknowledge and we all agree to. Now, what starts to happen, starting probably more into the 80s, I think you see is that some of those norms start to dissipate, and then there's sort of an arms race back and forth, right? Democrats in Congress start to cut out Republicans and strip them of powers that they used to have, and then they become resentful. Then when Gingrich comes into power in '94, which is where a lot of people would kind of put the starting point, and Gingrich punishes Democrats much more aggressively, and so you have this increasing cycle of punishing the losing party, disrespect for norms, increasingly nasty politics. Now, again, in the same way that Donald Trump didn't come out of nowhere, Newt Gingrich didn't come out of nowhere, but he just took it to the next level. Right? I mean, Democrats were abusing their power in Congress for a period of time.
So
as well,
you talk about
was, we could pick up that story in a number of places, but that's kind of the big picture.
So you talk about the dysfunction of polarization, but the theme of the paper, which caught my attention in terms of what you've done recently, is you talk about the fact that Congress is so weak now, and you want to solve the part of the problem through proportional representation. How will that get us to where we want to be?
Well, part of the reason that Congress is so weak now is because Congress is so polarized, right? So in a sense, the reason that Congress doesn't invest in its own institutional capacity is because members of Congress don't see Congress as an institution. They think of themselves first or foremost as Republicans or as Democrats, rather than as members of Congress. Now, if you don't view Congress as an institution, then you don't believe in investing in the institution. And if party structure is so top-down, you don't really have the imagination or capacity to legislate without other than as a partisan vehicle. Now, one of the things that would happen if you move towards a more proportional representation system, I believe, is that it would be much less likely for any party to have a permanent majority in Congress, because it would be you'd have multiple parties. So you'd take away that possibility of any one party sort of having the permanent dominant position in Congress, and you'd create a situation where parties would have to cooperate with each other in order to get anything done, and then that would force them to think of them rather than kind of being lured in by that siren song, the perpetual illusion of permanent dominance. They would no longer have that, and they could start thinking about Congress as an institution and investing in policymaking capacity. Moreover, you'd have to bring back a functioning committee system, which would require an investment in policy capacity.
So you have this dysfunctional Congress, and you want to get to some type of proportional representation, maybe more like a parliamentary system of sorts. And I don't know if this is exactly how you see it, but as Congress is becoming weaker, the executive branch is becoming stronger. And you were starting to get to the executive branch earlier.
Yeah, so that's another piece of the story, right, is that there's sort of a zero-sum nature to power, is that if Congress isn't exercising power, then the president is exercising power. And the president is a much more polarizing figure, because when you have a single president on top of a very divided society as we have, you wind up with a president who can only really be president for half the country. And the other half of the country has a very strong incentive to depose or to weaken the sitting president. So there's no basis for cooperation, right? You have this, you concentrate all of the division on one particular high stakes fight, and it creates a situation where whoever is the out party has no incentive to cooperate, to make deals, to give legitimacy. And so you've created really a fundamentally, you've made politics a fundamentally zero-sum game. And if in a legislature there's much more possibility for give and take, especially a proportional representationally allocated legislature. It's not a perfect system, and I don't want to hold it up as it's not a panacea. Look, a lot of European countries who have proportional representation systems are also struggling with the rise of authoritarian populism and a particular kind of political divisiveness. But I think they have a better tool for getting out of it, because in such a system it makes it easier to find new coalitions that can be majoritarian in ways to isolate extremism. Whereas in the two-party system in the U.S., it really just takes 26% of the population to be extremist to take over a major party that can win an election. And arguably that's what's happened with the Republican Party.
So in your article, I think the most hope, when I read your article, is this notion that we've got to really press to get back to our federalist roots and push as much problem solving down to the states and the cities. Is that a fair interpretation of where you're going here?
Yeah, I think that's, I think that there's a lot that can be done at the state and local level, and applying the principle of subsidiarity. If things can be done at the state and local level, they ought to be done at the state and local level. I think that takes some of the partisanship out of our politics by decentralizing a little bit, but I think there are real limits to what that can accomplish. So it can get us part of the way, but I think there are just because there are so many fundamental questions that have to be decided at the national level, especially the U.S. I mean, so it works well for Switzerland because Switzerland has no pretensions to being a world power, and it's a relatively it's not such a large nation that it, but the U.S. as a global economic power, there are a lot of questions that have to get decided at the national level. I mean, if we want to be, if we want to take ourselves from the world stage, then I think federalism and subsidiarity can work better, and we can become Switzerland if we want to. I think that would be a very hard thing for us to do. The federalism also doesn't solve about a bunch of civil rights and minority rights issues. Especially when you have, and you might say, well, people can move if they're in places that don't work for them, but a lot of poor people who are probably most affected don't really have the means to move.
Well, Lee, you're a great guest, and again, for my viewers, tell them a little more about your book so that everybody can run out and buy your book.
Oh, yeah. So my book is called The Business of America is Lobbying. It's available on anywhere on the internet, or maybe in some bookstores if those things still exist. And it's a paperback edition is coming out this spring. And people can also go. I write for Vox.com. I have a blog that's called Polarity, so people can also check that out if they want to see my more my regular writings. They can follow me on Twitter at Lee Drutman, and those are the main places to find what I'm up to.
Awesome. Well, thank you for your time today. You're a great guest, and I'll be interested in seeing some of your stuff. Maybe I'll get on Vox myself and check out more.
All right.
Thank you. Well, I certainly hope you enjoyed the interview with Professor Drutman. I particularly enjoy the historical context in which he puts dysfunction and polarization. I had never before thought to think that the roots of this might go back to the 1930s, and he brings us forward in a very interesting way. And I enjoy his theories. He obviously wants to fix the system. And whether there's some approaches within federalism or some other areas, that's interesting to look at. I suggest you take a look at his article. One thing we did not get to on today's show were some of his theories regarding the origins of the Electoral College and how getting back to the Electoral College roots might make a bit of a difference. So take a look at the article. And at all times on our show, we're looking at solutions. I think his article presents some very interesting solutions. If you're interested in catching up on other shows, you can find us at grassrootstv.org, where we have all the old shows in their entirety. And then on noneoftheabove.tv, which is our YouTube channel, you can dial in and get to specific interviews you want to see. You can, highlight one particular interview and get there in a hurry instead of watching the whole show. So grassrootstv.org and noneoftheabove.tv. Remember, if you're not part of the solution, you are part of the problem.